I get so emotional because I feel like shooting the show, it taught me that my capacity to love is deeper than I thought.
What if I told you that one of the most heavily promoted Star Trek shows in years didn't just underperform, it barely registered as an audience at all? Before we get into the numbers, take a second and hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear completely changes how you look at modern Star Trek, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. Let's start with the number. 40,000? That is the reported number of people who watched each episode of Star Trek, Starfleet Academy. Not 40 million, not even 400,000, 40,000. According to an insider claim discussed publicly by Mike Stoklasa on the Red Letter Media podcast, the entire first season, 10 episodes, pulled a combined total of roughly 400,000 views. Break that down, and you get about 40,000 per episode. If that number is accurate, it represents one of the lowest performing entries in the history of the franchise. Now, pause for a second, because numbers alone don't always tell the story. Context does. 40,000 views today is not a benchmark for television success. It's something a mid-level YouTube channel can hit in a day. A small podcast can reach it in a week. Even short-form content on apps like TikTok regularly surpasses that in hours. And this wasn't a small, experimental project. This was positioned as a flagship Star Trek series on Paramount, plus a platform with roughly 77 million subscribers. If only 40,000 people watched per episode, that's approximately 0.05% of the subscriber base. In simple terms, more than 99.9% of paying users chose something else. Not later, not eventually, immediately. And that's where the scale of the issue becomes clearer. Because this isn't just about viewership, it's about cost. Estimates place the production budget between 10 million and 20 million per episode. Even if you take the lowest possible number, 10 million per episode across 10 episodes, that's a $100 million investment. Now divide that by 40,000 viewers. You get $2,500 per viewer. That means, hypothetically, the studio spent $2,500 for every single person who watched one episode. There's no way to frame that as sustainable. That's not a minor loss. That's a structural problem. And this is where the comparison to earlier Star Trek becomes unavoidable. At its peak in the 1990s, Star Trek: The Next Generation averaged around 15 million viewers per episode. That's roughly 375 times higher than the reported number for Starfleet Academy. Patrick Stewart became synonymous with the franchise during that era, leading a show that reached a truly global television audience. Then you look at Star Trek: Voyager, led by Kate Mulgrew. That series regularly pulled between 4 and 8 million viewers per episode. Even Star Trek Deep Space Nine, often considered more niche, still averaged around 5 million viewers. And Star Trek Enterprise, a show widely labeled as a franchise low point at the time, still brought in 3 to 4 million viewers in its later seasons. So even the weakest performing Legacy-era show had an audience tens or hundreds of times larger than the reported figures for Starfleet Academy. That's not a small decline, that's a complete collapse in scale. Now, here's where things get more complicated. Because if the audience is that small, how do you explain the level of online support? Across platforms like X, Reddit, and YouTube comment sections, there has been a visible and vocal group defending the show. There have been petitions. There have been long threads arguing its value. There have been strong reactions to criticism. One petition reportedly gathered around 10,000 signatures. At first glance, that sounds significant. But if you compare it to a 40,000 viewer base, that would mean roughly 25% of viewers took the extra step to find, read, and sign a petition. That's an unusually high level of engagement for any show, especially one with limited reach. Now, there are multiple possible explanations. It could be a highly motivated niche audience. It could include people who didn't watch the show, but still support the franchise direction. Or it could reflect broader online amplification that doesn't directly correlate with actual viewership. What matters is this: the visible online conversation appears larger than the measurable audience. And that disconnect raises questions, not conclusions, but questions. Midway reminder, if you're still here, you're getting the full breakdown most people skip. Hit like and subscribe, because this is where it gets even more important. Let's talk about the public defense of the show. Several legacy figures connected to Star Trek have spoken positively about recent productions or responded critically to fan backlash. William Shatner, Kate Mulgrew, Jonathan Frakes, and Robert Picardo have all engaged publicly in discussions around the franchise and its direction. At the same time, newer voices like Gina Yashir and Mary Wiseman have defended modern iterations and addressed criticism directly. That creates a situation where longtime fans and franchise figures are sometimes talking past each other. From a studio perspective, this is a delicate position, because when audience numbers are strong, public debate doesn't carry as much weight. But when viewership is low, perception becomes critical. Every interview, every statement, every defense contributes to how the show is understood publicly. And right now, perception and reported data don't appear to align. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture. The current era of Star Trek has largely been shaped by Alex Kurtzman, who has overseen multiple series and projects under the franchise banner. If a flagship series under that leadership underperforms significantly, it doesn't just affect one show, it impacts the direction of the entire franchise. Because streaming platforms operate differently from traditional television. They rely heavily on retention, engagement, and subscriber value. A show doesn't just need viewers, it needs to justify its cost relative to the platform's overall strategy. If it doesn't, decisions follow. Budgets change, projects shift, leadership gets reevaluated. And that brings us to the future. There have already been discussions about new creative directions, including potential reboots or restructuring efforts involving figures like Simon Kinberg and executives such as David Ellison. Nothing is ever decided by a single number alone. But numbers like these, if accurate, become part of a much larger conversation about where the franchise goes next. And that's the key takeaway here. This isn't just about whether one show succeeded or failed. It's about what happens when audience behavior, production cost, and public perception stop aligning. Because when that happens, change usually follows. And in a franchise with a legacy as long as Star Trek, those changes tend to be significant. Now here's the final thought. For years, debates around modern Star Trek have been framed as divided opinions, fans versus critics, old versus new. But numbers real, verifiable numbers shift that conversation. They don't end debates, but they ground them. They turn subjective arguments into measurable outcomes. And if the reported figure of 40,000 is even close to accurate, then the conversation around Starfleet Academy isn't just about taste. It's about reach. Before you go, drop your take in the comments. Do you think that number is accurate? Or does the real figure look different behind the scenes? And more importantly, where do you think Star Trek goes from here? Because if this is a turning point, the next move might redefine the entire franchise. Subscribe now, because if another number like this surfaces, you'll want to see it first.